We can call this meeting to order. Tonight we have 3 items on the agenda. The first is the at-large vicious animal, AKA dangerous dog, portion of the animal control ordinance. Then we'll have a discussion about the police training facility update. And then last will be the drag racing in the valley and other parts of the city. So first up, we have the dangerous dog ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is an issue that we've discussed with the Public Safety Committee and their general goals as to how they would like to see us move forward on the regulation of animals and requiring owners to control their animals. And they thought it would be good for us to come to the Committee of the Whole to discuss the issue because it has wide applicability throughout the city and make sure that we're all on the same page policy-wise. The Public Safety Committee has not reviewed draft ordinance that we provided to you. I don't believe you got that until this afternoon, too. So our request is, if it seems like we're on the same page policy-wise, that we refer this back to the Public Safety Committee. And then, again, if everyone's on the same page, we could bring it for first reading upon a recommendation by the Public Safety Committee next week. I will say that our draft is fairly strict. I would say one of the most strict I've seen of other cities in requiring people to control their animals. So I just want you to be aware of that in case you feel like you need more public feedback from it. It does look like we don't have many people here to hear tonight, but I just wanted to throw that out there. So with that, I'll go over some of the goals of what we were looking at. And I'll put up some of the key provisions here. Sorry, I don't have it in a PowerPoint, but I can put the text up there to where you can see it if you want to. The first goal was really to strictly require owners to control all of their animals while off the owner's premises, even when on a leash. This issue came to my attention first with regard to an animal that killed another animal while it was on a leash. The issue that allegedly one dog came and approached the animal that was on the leash. The one that approached the animal on the leash was not on a leash. The animal on the leash responded and ended up killing the animal that was not on a leash. We have some enforcement difficulties with that under our dangerous dog, and you'll notice that we don't address dangerous dog in this draft ordinance. Dangerous dog is a term that's defined by the state. It's meant to have uniform applicability throughout the state. It's a mechanism for categorizing dogs and then controlling how owners manage those dogs after it's been declared a dangerous dog. In order to declare a dog dangerous, its actions to injure another person or animal must be unprovoked. The courts have really struggled with what that means to be unprovoked. The definition of provoke is very broad, it's just instigate. So it's difficult to declare a dog dangerous in a circumstance where another animal has first approached it, especially if the owner argues that it's instigated in a menacing fashion, I suppose. And the dog in this case would have been in violation of our laws for being off leash and out of control at that point too. So that complicates things. So what our goal here is to take out the provoke and just require people to control their dogs. In A up here, we say an owner is in violation if his or her animal is at large. And I'll switch over to the definition of at large to put that into context. So at large is simply off the premises and not under control, and then you can see the definition of under control that we have here. It must be restrained by a leash or other method to effectively restrain the animal from approaching, chasing, jumping upon, or lunging at any person, moving vehicle, or any domestic animal except as welcomed by invitation or mutual play. And then we put some specifics in there too. You can't, must restrain it from causing damage or injury to property or other animals or other persons. And I skipped B there, restrain from entering private property or public property where it's not authorized. We kind of combined, our old ordinance had things spread all throughout, both for dogs and other animals. It had at large used throughout it. We got rid of all of those and just really made it simple. You got to keep your animal under control at all times. There is an exception for cats. We kept that because there was an exception for cats before. Those are hard to regulate. Hard for the animal control officers to track down the cats and things like that. Cats are a little more wild in nature, but we did keep, and I'll switch back after going through the definition of at large there and under control. And under control is really the key to this whole ordinance. B there, injury caused by animal at large. We're making it a crime, and any owner of an animal is guilty of a crime if its animal physically injures another person or domestic animal or causes monetary damage to another person's real or personal property. We're making this a strict liability, and again, this is a draft. We're talking about this for your feedback, but we're making it a strict liability crime that if you're the owner of a dog and it does these things, we can prove our case in court. We can go to court and we can prove our case, and it's only subject to an affirmative defense. So really simple. You're the owner of a dog. Your dog injures somebody. Your dog causes damage to property, you're guilty of a crime, subject only to an affirmative defense. And we make clear in our draft language here that we're intending to make this strict liability. The reason why is because when you're talking about a crime, the city has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all of the elements of the crime, and we wanted that proof to be easy to prove. In that it happened. Dog was off the premises, it injured somebody. That's pretty much the elements, and then you got to prove that the person is the owner. We also broaden the definition of owner to where it can apply to the legal owner, it can apply to the dog walker, it can apply to anybody that has basically taken possession of and the right to control that animal. The idea is that the officers would certainly be using discretion to not be charging crimes for everyone. This affirmative defense allows, if the owner can show that they took such precautions that were within his or her control to prevent the violation as a reasonable person would in the same or similar circumstances, knowing what the owner knew or should have known at the time of the animal's disposition. So we have that language to the language about what the owner knew or should have known to address the situation where we have a dog that has a history of being violent. We expect that a jury would hold them to a higher standard. If the dog had previously killed another dog, then they better take some extra precautions, put a muzzle on the dog, whatever it is. But we didn't want to define what those precautions are because it can really be fact dependent as to the situations as to what you should do to prevent the dog from injuring another. It may be making sure that your fence is fixed so the dog can't get out. It may be having a leash, it may be having a muzzle. It just kind of depends on the disposition of the dog. And we were willing to leave that broad and up to a jury so a jury could, jury and or the officer's discretion in not filing in the first place. Same with the prosecution, could not file in the first place. But to decide what's reasonable in those circumstances, it's difficult to judge ahead of time as to exactly what precautions you should take depending on what the disposition of the dog is.
So,
Yeah,
right?
Ms. Price.
You referred the animal as a dog, but
This is
we're
all
talking
animals.
about
I
all
apologize.
animals. Okay,
Yeah,
it's
this
okay.
came up in the context of dogs. One of the things that we did, we used to have an at-large animal except for cats and dogs, and then we had separate language for dogs. And it's somewhat confusing to have those multiple references there. And then we had different references at large for in-heat dogs, at large for chickens, at large for all these different things. And what we've done is get rid of all of the specifics and just clump it all into one. You got to control your animal. So yes, if it's a horse or an alligator or a whatever it be, people are going to be responsible for controlling their animal. That's under this language. So I don't know if you have specific questions or hypotheticals as to how how the language would apply. I could give my best guess at how I think it would apply in certain situations, but it's really, the intent as it's written is intended to be strict, to make sure that people control their animals. If there's no injury involved, it's generally going to be an infraction. An infraction, an officer has to see it in order to write the infraction and file it with the court. So another thing that we did was add an enforcement provision to where code enforcement can enforce. And what we had in mind here was repeated concerns of animals getting out of fences, for example. So there's times where, you know, the police are getting calls, hey, this dog's out at large in the street, and the police can't write an infraction where it's an infraction because they have to witness it happening. So in that case, the police would coordinate with our code enforcement team, and the code enforcement team could write them up based upon, without having seen it. The must witness is based upon a court rule and a state law. We can deal with not witnessing it through code enforcement. They can also order them through the ordinance to fix a fence, to confine a dog in another way. We leave it very open to whatever needs to be done to abate the nuisance. We've declared dogs that are getting out in violation of this to be a nuisance. So the code enforcement team would be able to treat it as a nuisance and order them to take actions to stop the nuisance from occurring. So it gives us an extra tool in the toolbox essentially to where we no longer have to worry about, oh, well, it's sounding like, oh, we can't do anything because we didn't see it. It gives us some extra tools to deal with those problem cases. Any other highlights? I mentioned that we cleaned up the code. We're removing a lot of the references to at-large and combining it all in this one simplified section. Another thing we did is we changed the definition to vicious animal, and I started off talking about we were limited in dealing with dangerous dogs because dangerous dogs are defined by state law and require this provocation or this unprovoked standard. We revised the definition of vicious animal to include dogs before we specifically excluded dogs, and basically make it to where if a person knows or has reason to know if their dog gets out, or their animal, if their animal gets out, that it is likely to cause injury to someone, to property or person or domestic animal, then if it does, it becomes a crime, even if it doesn't cause that injury. So it has a history of causing injury to someone. If it gets out, then it becomes a crime, and then we can enforce it as a misdemeanor. So it's pretty strict, but it's designed to be able to address these situations where we're acting off of reports that we haven't witnessed of serious situations. And I guess the example that I'd give to put things into context for the reason why, a reason why you might want to regulate it this strictly. In the example that I started out with, where the one dog runs up to the other dog and the dog that's on a leash kills the other. Think of it as a 3-year-old running up to that dog and pulling its tail, provoking it under the state law potentially, but that dog now kills the 3-year-old. If we're relying upon just the dangerous dog statute, we've got to worry about proving that was an unprovoked action, even if a 3-year-old came up and pulled its tail. This ordinance would allow us to say, no, you knew or should have known that your dog has a tendency to react violently when it's provoked. And because you knew that, you should have taken extra precautions. You should have put a muzzle on your dog. You shouldn't have taken it out on the leash even in situations where other people are around, depending on what the circumstances and what the disposition of the dog are. So that's the one that I kind of keep in what I'm thinking of as I'm like, wow, this seems really strict, but that's the idea, is to protect against those situations that the state law really doesn't help us very much with because of that provoked language. Any questions,
Any
feedback?
questions at the time? Yeah, Ms. Gucci?
2 questions. Under J, where it discusses the proper enclosure of a dangerous dog, and it says dangerous specifically, but it's relying on that owner to make sure that the dog is secure when they're not home, whether it be in a cage or somehow enclosed in a pen. I'm not sure if the wording includes this, but you see dogs in yards with chains and ropes, and they're attached to a tree, but they're not enclosed in a pen. The first question, would that be considered the right course of action, or at least taking the necessary precautions? And the second question would be, is it safe to assume that trespassing eliminates all of these rules if someone were to go into that yard, even though the dog is contained, and the dog gets out for some reason? Is there a,
So this is an area that I have not yet changed because it's dealing with the state law dangerous dog. That's actually a definition that tracks along with the state law, and it's fairly inapplicable right now because we don't allow dangerous dogs. So if it's a dangerous dog, it's just not allowed to be here, regardless of whether it's in a proper enclosure for a dangerous dog. So this is cleanup that we still plan on doing. We may be able to bring that to the Public Safety Committee by next week, but we need to walk through some of the processes internally to make sure that we're lining up with state law too.
but any dog, if any dog were in a pen in a yard and someone trespassed, or if they were just attached to a rope?
Yeah, so the definitions here making strict liability apply only to off premises. So if it's off their premises is all this applies to.
Okay,
If it's on their property, then the dangerous dog scheme could apply. The dangerous dog scheme does to the extent they have a dangerous dog, does apply to that. But again, because we don't allow dangerous dogs unless you want to allow dangerous dogs, it's fairly inapplicable there. Civil law would come in, and the same statute that adopts the dangerous dog definition creates a strict liability civilly for people whose dogs injure other people, and I'm pretty sure that makes an exemption for if someone was trespassing on their property.
and then my second question was, if a dog is on the loose at large and the owner's not home, he's not necessarily dangerous, he's never hurt anybody. Most people will call those in because they're trying to protect the dog.
Right.
They don't want it to get hit by a car, they're not necessarily thinking he's gonna attack a person, they just wanna make sure the dog is safe. If animal control then picks up the animal and takes it into our vet or to our shops, do they then get that at-large citation just for the fact that even though, I mean, technically it was witnessed because animal control picked the dog up?
All citations are within the discretion of the officers. My understanding, and the chief may be able to talk more on this, but my understanding is that our officers use quite a bit of discretion in whether to issue infractions. They could issue an infraction in that situation. Historically, our fines have been very high, and the court's actually working on changing those fines. There's been a $250 fine plus mandatory statutory assessments, which bring it up to a $513 fine. So with that fine being that high, our animal control officers are very hesitant to issue any fines at this point. My understanding is the court is looking to lower, and it has discretion to lower the fines through its court rules. So it's looking at doing that. So there might be more infractions that are issued, especially if it's easy to prove and the fines are lower, but they'll still retain their discretion, and depends on the circumstances. My understanding right now, it takes some warnings, the owner
Yeah.
messed up and should have known better.
We see the same dogs
Situation.
getting out over and over again, so I'm assuming that repeat offenders would eventually get fined.
Those would be more likely to receive a fine
Okay, thank you.
and/or code enforcement attention after this is passed.
Ms. Perez?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's a great presentation. I'm a dog owner and I love dogs in general. So if my dog gets lost and someone call me and tell me, gee, we have your dog, believe me, I will pay them just because I will feel so relieved that they rescue my family, you know. So my question will be, as Councilmember Which mentioned, if there is someone that you know that they are letting the dog go out around the neighborhood, and because they know that they're gonna come back, and then once in a while they call and say this dog is out, but the dog is not dangerous. It's just going out, but it's going to other neighbors' yards and things like that. And how many times it takes to be a repeat offender or calling from the neighbors to finally say, hey, we are gonna start charging you a fee because you are not compliant with the rules and regulations?
I mean, I can't speak for the animal control officers, but I would imagine the first time would be free after discussion, and further violations, they could be fined.
Thank you.
Any other questions this time? Okay, I have a committee report, and I'm going to read it. The Committee of the Whole recommends concurrence in the staff recommendation to refer the draft ordinance amending RMC Chapter 6-6 to clarify owners' responsibilities to keep the animals under control and strengthen penalties for violations to the Public Safety Committee for review and recommendation to the full council. And I'm signing it. Okay, thank you very much. And next up, we have the police training facility update presentation. Let's see here. It should pop up there. Oh, maybe.
Want it on a computer? No.
Oh, actually, yeah.
Cycling through.
Good evening, Council President Pavoni, members of council. My name is Kevin Malosich, Police Chief for the City of Orinda, and to my left is Commander Dave Lieben. I'm going to give you kind of a presentation of the initial report we received regarding a training center assessment for the police department. And, you know, the reason for this is a couple years ago, we were aware of the potential loss of our current facility at 200 Mill. At the same time, relying on some private entities to allow us to do our firearms training. We decided to look at the feasibility of having a new training facility. And so this is really the first phase, is basically the need assessment. And then I'll let the Commander Lieben take over.
Thank you. Give you a short timeline. Back in, right around 2014 is when we first heard that 200 Mill might possibly become unavailable at some point. At that point, we started to look for some private or some public space. We looked at surplus facilities here in the city. We looked at storefronts. We looked at a variety of things. But one thing that was evident pretty early on was that since we really didn't know what we needed, the space we were looking at, we really didn't know if it was going to do what we needed it to do. So in about May of 2015, I started to research some private public sector training organizations or organizations that do consulting in that respect. Found out there were very, very few companies in the nation that do that kind of work. And of the few that there was one that kind of rose to the top, so I focused on that one. I met with Peter Renner, facilities, back in May of 2015. It took some time to arrange the consultant to come up. They are based in California. By the time we all met, some time had gone by. Peter liked what he saw quite a bit, and we started to move forward, and then he retired. So Michael Kirk took his place, and we started the whole process again with Michael. And again, because it was an out-of-state training organization, it took a long time to get together. We did that again, and eventually here we are. So we ended up with a company called the Interact Group. They are California-based. They're nationwide. They do a variety of different things, but they do predominantly strategic planning for training centers. That's their bread and butter. They offered to do a comprehensive study for us that would take our organization all the way from our concept all the way up through figuring how we're going to fund it and site it. They do a complete menu. One big advantage of going with this type of company versus like a developer or an architect is those kinds of organizations have a reason to make things a little bigger, I guess, if you will. If they have a bigger project, they get to charge us more money. This company doesn't care. They give us they'll analyze it the way we want it to, and they'll give us the facts, and whether or not we use their information, they have no skin in that game whatsoever. So it's very, very objective, much more so than any other type of organization. So Interact has been involved with a lot of really big training centers across the United States. In this area, the Northwest, they did the Seattle Police Department's training center. They did Portland Police Bureau's training center. So we do have some things we can look at to see what kind of successes they've had in the area, and those are both very good centers. So when we looked at their product, and they were willing to give us this A to Z product, we decided that instead of doing that, we would just maybe split it up into thirds. And we'd see if the first part of what we asked them to do met our satisfaction, and if it did, then we perhaps would go on to phase 2 and 3. And so that's what we did, and that's the report that you have, is the phase 1 report. And it's narrowly designed just to answer the questions that are on the slide. Who's going to use the training facility? What training will be provided at the facility? 4 tasks involved in this phase. There was going to be an internal training needs, a focus group meetings, a web-based survey, a needs assessment generator tool. But the bottom line is what we wanted at the end of phase 1 was a complete understanding of the current training requirements, current training hours, and the long-term training demand and assets required for the center. So some of what you saw, if you really went through the report page by page, looks like a lot of raw data which may not be well explained, and that's exactly what it is, because there's intended to be a phase 2 that takes that raw data and massages it into something that we can look at and put value on the different parts of the report that came back. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If we were to continue on, the other 2 phases, phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 is, again, taking the raw data and making it into something that we can say, okay, now we know what we need and how much we're going to use it. What value do those components have? Because as you'll see in a minute, some things that they say that we could use aren't going to get used very much, and yet they could possibly be very valuable as far as liability and training. And phase 3, it would be the actual, the money part of it, the siting part of it, and the building part of it, if we were to get to that point. So what was studied? We did a detailed analysis of each and every type of training the department is involved in. After we did that, we were to have done an internal needs assessment where we were going to have all the department heads come in and talk about if we were to build a training center or facility, what types of things could we add in there that might be of use to other parts of the city. There was a scheduling snafu, and that was not done, but that's an easy thing to do if we choose to do it later on. And a similar thing with our external partners in the area. So we asked other law enforcement agencies and private entities like Boeing and Valley Medical to come in again to see if we were to build any kind of facility, would we be able to offer them something they could also use and maybe even help pay for our facility with. One thing that really came out of this was that the sheer amount of training that the police department does came to focus maybe for the first time. We're very compartmentalized. There are a lot of different specialty groups within the police department, and this was the first time to really look at all the training that we do as a police department, all the different specialties, all the different groups. It was very, very eye-opening, and we'll talk about some numbers in a slide or two from here. This was a portion of the results. They identified the number and variety of different tasks and training RPD is involved in. And it's a fairly comprehensive list, but actually in many of these categories there are subcategories even beneath that. So these are just pretty much the main ones, but some of these trainings, for example, scenario training is very generic. There's lots of different kinds of scenario training. It could be mental health, contacting somebody with mental health illnesses, or the homeless, or it could be a traditional tactical situation. But we just have it listed as scenario training, but it's really much deeper than that. I think this is what really surprised me and also my training officers, because my 2 training officers, if anybody knows the training we do in the police department, it would be them. And they did not even realize 40,000 hours of annual training for our police department is what we're currently doing. That is a lot of hours. When Interact analyzed that, I'll go for the good news first. They talked about that we're doing pretty well with 43% of our training. So that would be Category 3. This training is being carried out to a satisfactory level of competence. They did mention, however, that 41% of the higher liability training could be done a little bit better. And they also said that 15% of the training that our resident experts identified as desirable cannot be done currently with the facility that we have. This is just a couple more examples. These two tables are looking at slightly different data, but both are examples of classroom and prop areas that have an anticipated amount of use. And you can see some of the usage on some of the things are very high and some are very low. Again, though, this is raw data, and as I mentioned before, some of the things that aren't utilized a lot actually could be extremely valuable and also could be very marketable if we were to go in with another entity, another police agency, or invite other people to come in and use our facility. If we do go into phase 2, they'll be able to take this data and make it a lot more usable for us. They did identify some issues and concerns. You have that in your report, so I'm not going to belabor them. Here's a list of them. We could do some things better in those areas that are on the slide. What Interact says is becoming an industry standard is that training that has to be safe and secure and consistent. And as you go through the report, if you look at the things that we're currently doing or not doing, and you apply, are they safe, are they secure, and or are they consistent, then you can make your own determination on whether or not there's value in those things. So in summary, this confirmed what we knew to some extent. It really added a lot more context. It gave us a little more information about what we didn't know. Now we know. Again, really, we're doing pretty well in some areas. We've got 43% of the stuff we're doing, and out of 40,000 hours, which we're doing spot on. Obviously, we need to plan for the immediate present, the potential loss of 200 mil, and then we need to plan for the future. You know, what are we going to do about some of these bigger ticket items and things that are becoming more prevalent? If we do move forward into phase 2, then we can certainly continue to talk with our area partners and see what sort of role that they can play in it. This was just a first blush with doing that. But at the end of the day, I think it's obvious. Renton Police Department is doing pretty well. You can turn on your TV or open your newspaper, and you're not going to generally see us in there. You're going to see a lot of other places. And I'm going to have to pat our training people on the back for that. I think that has a lot to do with it. We've got a dedicated group of trainers, and they care, and they put a lot of time and effort into what they do, and I think that's why we're successful. I guess the only other thing I'd have to say is that in law enforcement, it's obviously pretty complicated at the moment, and we can't make mistakes in real life. If there are mistakes to be made, they have to be made in a training environment. So, you know, I'm hoping to move forward and get the best one we can. Thank you.
Just to kind of give an example, like for firearms training, we do firearms training 4 times a year. But in order to run a department of 128 commissioned through a monthly firearms qualification, typically that means we run in groups of 6 to 8 for 2 hours. You can usually get 3 groups in a day, and we have to identify 6 days in a month. So it takes basically 6 full days to put the commission part of the department through a 2-hour training class. And that's just with firearms. You know, we schedule in-service training. We're required for 30 hours of in-service training annually. We schedule 24, and we can usually find the 6 hours elsewhere. But for the most part, you know, it doesn't sound like a lot of hours, but then you times that by the department, and that's just to meet the bare minimum standards. And obviously, that's not enough. Training is the #1 thing that is looked at both locally and nationally when it comes to liability. Each year, there's more and more demands on law enforcement for training. Each year in the state and the legislature, they continue to add more required training on law enforcement. And so training is not going to end. In fact, it's only going to increase in years to come in more complex topics.
So Chief, what's the next step here to kind of deciding the needs of the training facility and the scope of what we're going to do in-house and what we're going to use outside services for?
I think we go back to the slide to phase 2, that's kind of the next step, would be to, you know, figure out exactly, you know, the scope of the project. I mean, realistically, I don't see us building a driving range. It's one of those topics that perhaps, you know, we could partner with another law enforcement agency or other law enforcement agencies in the valley to build something that large. And so it's really about scope as far as how big of a facility, you know, can meet, say, 95% of our needs, and potentially looking for partners for the other 5-10%.
One of the things I'm curious about is the indoor shooting range. What's your thoughts and recommendations on that? It seems like that's an issue where it's a extremely high liability kind of scenario. So,
first of all, there is a need. Currently, we contract with a range in Bellevue to do 2 indoor shoots a year, and then we use outdoors up at Renton Fish and Game, the 2 drier parts of the year for quarterly training. At the same time, we're dependent on a private entity. You know, as long as they're in business and they have room for us, they will provide for us. But all it takes is for them to go out of business or or find, a way to be more financially feasible for them to not contract with us, then we lose that option.
All right.
And so I think at some point, we need to look at the potential of a range, either department-specific or potentially teaming up with other jurisdictions.
I think, council, I think we'll want to talk about this administratively a little bit and see we have the capacity internally for things like classroom facilities, probably even space for defensive tactics, and potentially space for certain simulations in this building on the 4th floor. So we want to talk about that a little bit amongst ourselves and determine what there is. And then, as the chief said, I think some of those larger potential needs, like a firearms training facility or something else, I think we want to talk a little bit with our neighbors to the past. We may want to investigate the idea of a SCORE-like facility where could be jointly owned by Valley Cities, and we would all have access to it, and it's relatively close, and other things. So I think what we'll do is take a look at this information and get back to you with a recommendation on how we approach phase 2.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Just a statement.
Comment?
I think that we need to work on the classroom space first, because I understand the shooting. If there's going to be a shooting range, the last thing we most likely want to do is undertake one of those by ourselves. So that would be should be a regional facility, because of the cost, not only the cost of the building, the cost of the maintenance, the cost of
Ventilation.
the ventilation, I mean, and all the things that go with it. So, but I think there should be a kind of maybe a phased approach so that we can take care of, I've been through this, and a lot of it has to do with good square footage that is properly built out to do the hands-on training, basically, that we're doing at the old City Hall, which is, I can't believe we've been doing it as long over there as we have. We're long overdue, so I feel somewhat of an urgency to move at least the classroom and the defensive tactics and that kind of stuff that we should do as quickly as possible. Because those training are so important to our citizens, to our police officers, for their safety, everybody's safety. So the approach that Jay's is, I don't think we need an expert to come and tell us what we need when we most likely have the best experts in the world in what our needs are in our training division. Those guys have been well trained. They're good at what they do, and they know the community. They know what the state law requires. So Jay's approach, I think, would work very well, but I personally have a sense of urgency. I think this should be one of our number one priorities.
And I agree with that. I was bringing up the range mostly because I think we'd be remiss to not include that. Because if that's the interest that we're going to do, I think we need to look at it now. The cost of building something like that's only going to go up as time goes on. So it's only going to become more difficult if that's the direction we're going to go. So.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I think we could do it in phases and do one quicker than the other, because you're talking millions of dollars to build a range of some kind. And then the operating cost of it is, and it makes sense to do it and share it.
Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
I lost my screen.
So next, we'll talk about racing.
Drag racing.
Sergeant Judd's going to provide an overview of what's actually happening in the city of Renton. I know you receive complaints, I receive complaints regarding noise of racing primarily in the valley, and the complaints typically come from our residents up on Talbot Hill. So Sergeant Judd will kind of give you an overview of what is actually taking place out there, what are we doing about it, and some potential strategies for the future.
Mr. President.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't get it out.
You just pull the whole thing off.
I'll pull the whole thing out.
Thought so.
Caroline didn't like my hairdo.
What's happening?
Our names are
need to
backwards.
switch.
She would have her name tag.
Oh,
Council makes you age quickly and lose your hair.
There. Now my hairdo okay?
yeah.
I could have done it during the break.
Anytime you're ready.
Thank you. Just some background information in case you haven't been lucky enough to be a part of the racing experience on the weekends. It's a group of highly organized racers. They have internal communications where they speak amongst each other, texting, using GPS and things of that nature to give out locations of where they're going, and they move in groups. It's not uncommon to have hundreds of vehicles, sometimes on nice hot days, 400 plus. So the groups and the subgroups, they loiter around, they litter themselves around 43rd, Oakesdale, onto the Kent side. They're everywhere. So imagine on a busy weekend day, when you drive down 43rd and you look to the left and the right, you see the parking lots are full. Imagine double that capacity, because they're not only in their spaces, they're everywhere. And they're standing outside of the car, doing all kinds of different things. So that's kind of the setting. So they loiter for a while, then they jump in the cars, they'll communicate amongst each other, they have leadership, and they jump in the cars and they drive out to one of the 5 tracks. There's 5 tracks, and when I say tracks, they're basically cities. So we have several. 27th is one, 34th is one, Oakesdale is the big one. Some of the ones that we used to have have gone away, but those are the big ones. Kent has several, Tukwila has several, Auburn has a couple, and West Seattle has a couple. So what they do is they just go in a circuit all night long. They'll go to one location, they'll race 15, 20 minutes, they'll put out scouts in all areas, and then if a police officer comes, they communicate with each other, and then everybody takes off. So prior to that, if they are just left unchecked and in motion, they just move in groups. Sometimes the group is hundreds, sometimes it's 20, 30, 50. It just depends on what's going on. So as they move around, these cars have excessive noise, and every time they go anywhere, anytime you accelerate, it's that officious, obnoxious, loud, whining, humming kind of sound that gets everybody excited and generates a lot of complaints. Renton is a hub because Renton has some great locations to race. Kent has some great locations to race. 167 is right there, and 43rd is right in the middle of both. So if they'll go to Renton, or they'll go to Kent, then they'll head to Tukwila, they'll go to West Seattle, they'll come back to Renton, they may go to Auburn, but the common denominator is 167. So they're always on it, it's an open road, and they're accelerating, and it sounds like a raceway all night long. Even though they may not be racing, they're just driving, but the cars are so obnoxious that it puts off a lot of noise. So with that, with all these groups, we've had an increased calls for service, other reckless and dangerous behavior that's associated with large groups of people, and other nuisance behavior like trespassing, malicious mischief, littering, things of that nature. And this isn't This issue isn't new to Renton. We've had racing issues for a long time. In the 20 years that I've been here, it's always been an issue, and prior to that, it was an issue. So we have a long history of vehicles and loitering at night and things of that nature. It's a little different now than it was. In my opinion, I think the excessive noise plays a big role in that. When cars move from, just the movement of one place to the other is, I mean, it's obnoxious and everyone can hear it. And they make sure that they gun it and accelerate, and they may not even be going at outrageous speed, but it sounds like they're going, 80 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour. So that's a big part of it. They generate more criminal activity than they used to, and they seem to be more brazen. Where in the past, if you drove through a parking lot or you drove down 43rd, they would go, okay, we're gonna move and we're gonna go somewhere else. That's really not the case anymore. They really do not leave until they have to. So in terms of range of our response, obviously we have patrol that works all the time, and they handle calls for service when they come in. If they're able to and they have time to proactively patrol, they hit those areas and they push people out, try and get people to move, because patrol is really not equipped to deal with the huge numbers of vehicles. When you're talking multiple hundreds of cars, it's difficult to get them to move and to get out of the area. So basically, when you're in that area, everywhere you look in a parking lot, there's cars, and so you might be able to clear one parking lot and they just drive to the next one. So it's difficult for those guys who are working patrol to actually have a huge impact. But I've noticed, and I can tell when they're able to get out there, there's a big difference in our complaints that I take the next Monday morning, or the emails that come in from these calls. Additionally, we have dedicated emphasis patrols. Now, that's done on overtime, and in order for that to be effective, people have to volunteer to work for them. And based on staffing and overtime and kind of how it ebbs and flows, sometimes there's more officers available than others. So some weekends there may be several, some weekends there may be none. Then we also have multi-agency task force emphasis that we participate in as well. So with that, some of our strategies, we have high visibility where we're out there, we're making contacts, area denial, we're trying to get people to leave the area, go somewhere else. You're not welcome here. Businesses, we have a good relationship with the businesses. They don't want them there. Unfortunately, we can't provide the service to get them all out of the closed businesses because there's so many and there's so much property. But we try and do that. Another thing is criminal arrests and traffic enforcement, where we go out and stop as many cars as we can, try and get the word out. And then saturation patrols, moving erasers outside of Renton, following people around, stuff like that. So then a plan for the future. Having dedicated officers on overtime, again, it's subject to staffing and availability. Racer task force surge patrols with other departments, and partnering with the National Insurance Crime Bureau. Thought it would be a good idea to partner with the prosecutors in some of the valley cities to discuss the SOAR ordinance and maybe look at additional ways that we could strengthen that and maybe make it more up to date. Have a consistent coordinated effort between agencies and share resources. And then overall, what we're looking to accomplish is we're trying to reduce the likelihood of serious collisions. We're trying to reduce and deter street racing and the other nuisance complaints that go along with those. So,
One of the issues on the SOAR ordinance, I know we get, a lot of people question why we have a sign posted on Oakdale and 27th and others that attendance at street racing is illegal. But because we're required to do that so people have knowledge, because if you're unaware of a crime, you can't commit a crime. So we have to prove that people have knowledge that they can't attend a race. However, we're seeing those signs being stolen because these racers kind of understand that too. And so I think more recently we were down there and Bill was saying, you know, all their signs were stolen off the, you know, the posts down in the valley floor. And so that's something we need to look at, how to do it a little bit differently.
So has there been any, like, creative ideas, cameras or barriers or barricades? I mean, is there anything
Well, there's-
outside of the box that we're looking at?
I think one of the issues I've had conversations with traffic engineering. You know, I'm all for speed bumps, but then you're talking, the fire departments aren't excited about speed bumps or speed humps. I'm all for putting up maybe those little, you know, half-inch little rumble bars in the valley
Yeah.
floor, but then that means all our commercial traffic, as they're driving up and down the valley floor, is gonna be driving over those rumble bars. And so we're still looking at ways to do something a little bit differently. You know, in the past, we've contemplated actually, in some of our other areas, actually installing gates where there's no traffic after hours, but then that's really not feasible either. And so it's an area that we continue to, you know, to think about and discuss with all the partner agencies in the south end. They're dealing with this.
Yes.
What about the cameras? I mean, we have cameras in school zones to catch people speeding there. Would that be a strategy we could employ?
Photo enforcement cameras, I believe by ordinance, maybe Sergeant Judge can correct me, you can only do photo enforcement for red lights and intersections, and you can only use cameras for speed enforcement in school zones. They're not authorized in any other areas.
And would that be the legislature that grants that authority? Is that, okay.
Yes.
And the businesses in the area, I mean, they probably want the racing gone also, I'd imagine. I mean, it's
Most of them.
litter and broken windows. I don't know if there's any crimes being created in the area.
Yeah, it's, a lot of the businesses in the south end have been working with this and have posted their property, no trespassing. And some of the businesses, like on that 43rd line with both the Renton and the Kent side, some of the businesses in the past have kind of tolerated them because they do provide some business. When you've got 50, 60 cars parked in your parking lot and you're in, purchasing, food or whatnot at the convenience store. And so we haven't been that successful with some of the businesses. And then it runs hot and cold between the Renton side and the Kent side. So I know Kent's starting to be a little more proactive, a little more aggressive on their side, which is starting to push them back over to our side.
Yes.
Well, everybody knew I was going to chime in on this one. First of all, this is not it's solely a police problem, and we will never solve it until we look at it holistically. I've been through this with the loop.
I was just going to bring that up, actually.
I mean, we used to arrest hundreds of people every night. We'd fill the old carport with people that we had arrested, and it didn't help. And the only way that we were able to solve the loop when it was decided that it was a citywide problem. So we got the help of Public Works, the city attorneys, which we have now done. I'm not being disparaging, it should all. And we got a anti-cruising ordinance, and we had Public Works out there coning off streets on Fridays and Saturday nights, Rainier Avenue down to one lane each direction. And it only took about 2 weekends, and it was over. So, I just see a multitude of things that we have to do. We have to change our little bit of an attitude. I think there's speed bumps that we've looked at before that fire trucks can straddle.
Yes.
And big trucks can straddle. So there's some I firmly believe there's some engineering things we can do. I like Ryan just made a idea pop in my head, is I think we need to get a group of cities together and go to the state legislature and say, hey, we got this racing problem. We're not the only ones having this problem. I'm sure it's all over the Northwest. and go to the legislature and say, you need to expand this photo camera to allow us to use a photo enforcement. And start thinking, start thinking that, and then maybe if, I don't know, and this would be again the city attorney, if there's some way that we can force some of these the people that have the parking lots, if we can encourage them to gate them off on that side, so that the people, if once they get in there, they're trespassing and there's only one way out, and you could have somebody, they can just stand in line to get their ticket on the way out, so, but it's gonna take, it takes everybody. It's just not just the police department. Everybody's gotta take a look at it, so I don't know what the process is, but that's my recommendation is, I know that the police officers hate it as much as anybody, if not more. I mean, they want to solve this. There's just no ifs, buts, or ands about it. But it isn't just their problem, it's everybody's problem. And it's really affecting the health and the welfare of a certain segment of our society. So I propose that when you're talking about a task force, that you include the business owners, the engineering, and Greg is back there, and Greg was there, helped us with the loop, and people that can come up with some suggestions. I know the fire chief's in the back, most likely not liking what I'm saying about speed bumps, but maybe we can have engineering, the city shops put out temporary speed bumps on the weekends. I mean, just make it physically not, and I'm just talking from experience, but we need to, and it's gonna cost some money.
I
And
like the idea of reducing it down to one lane.
Yeah, I
on
was
the
just gonna say the
weekend.
same
That's
thing.
the easiest one with the
Shut
flashing
down
lights. If you don't
shut
have
down the
two lanes,
inside
you
lanes.
can't race.
Yeah, shut down the inside lanes and just leave the outside lanes
so,
open.
anyway, I mean, it's just some issues.
I guess the picture we wanted to paint is that it's, most of the activity is just loitering. They're just hanging around, waiting until someone texts the right information of where they're gonna go. And when they do race, it's short. It's like 10 or 15 minutes and they're done. So by the time we get called and we get down there, they're done. They're just now going down to loiter, and then they move up and down 167, and that's the noise that we get from the complaints of our residents on Talbot. Just, 300 to 400 cars with those loud mufflers going up
Mufflers.
and down 167.
Bumblebee.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's, I think we've done a pretty good job working with the property owners down there. But at some point, you've got 300-400 vehicles, it gets challenging to, for a half a dozen cops that we can dedicate down there on a nightly basis, and so.
Right.
Mr. President? I understand what you say about having too many cars already ready for race, but if they know already that they cannot race in that area, and if you say that they communicate with each other, if they know that there is a barrier there, chances are that the cars are not going to get together because they already know that they're not going to be able to race. I am making an assumption, but maybe I'm wrong. My other bigger concern is that the vast majority of the people that live on Talbot neighborhood are the ones that are impacted the most. And the customer service provided to them, normally these phone calls go around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning during the weekends. And obviously they are extremely upset because they are waking up in the middle of the night by these cars racing and this noise that it literally have been there, and it sounds like they are racing in front of their house. And I know that I'm not saying anything new to you guys, but when they call the dispatcher or whoever they call in, that also is really important how we're going to address this to them, because it is part of their frustration that they feel that this solution is not here and it's happening weekend after weekend, and they keep calling and they don't feel that it's nothing in the process that is, they don't feel that feedback that yes, we're doing something to solve it. And I think it would be great if we can get back to those residents and express to them our own frustration and what are their ideas and what are our ideas to resolve this and include them.
Like I said earlier, the biggest challenge is most of that noise is just these hundreds of cars doing the speed limit up and down 167. I mean, I'm sure you've driven around town and maybe heard one or two of these little racer cars with a really loud muffler. You times that by 300-400 in the still of the night when it's hot out and you got your windows open. And there's, they're legally going up and down 167. We can't prevent them from doing that. That's our frustration. We've tried to explain to the citizens that complain.
But if we can take Renton out of their link, we can keep them in Auburn and Kent.
That's the goal.
That's, even West Seattle is fine, yeah. Any other questions
I did
at
have
this
one
time?
question about
Yes.
fatalities and injuries, because if you drive through Kent, you just see one memorial after another along those speed racing zones. Have we had any major injuries or even deaths in Renton as a result of the street racing that we can maybe, mention to people as they're considering this as a hobby?
Yes, we had, wasn't last year, I believe we had one down there? Or was it 2 years ago?
Last summer, we had a race where, I'm not sure which one was ahead, but at some point, one T-boned the other one, and it was at 100 miles an hour, is what we calculated that. So the hit was 100 mile an hour hit, which is pretty significant. So fortunately, there was no fatalities in that, but there was several broken femurs and life-changing injuries. It was amazing that car caught on fire. It was amazing that there were no fatalities. So that's pretty extreme. Last year we had on 34th a motorcycle that we believe was racing. That was a fatality. So it seems like at least once a summer, either here or close to us, there's a fatality or a near fatality. I mean, it's pretty common.
But it's dangerous for the spectators too. So if there's some public service announcement that would provide this type of information, I don't know if it would help at all.
The car that was T-boned had 3 people in it. So, I mean, all the spectators are in cars. So, yeah, it's dangerous for everyone
Yeah.
that's out there.
I actually have one more question. When you were talking earlier, you brought up a partner with National Insurance Crime Bureau. And what's the purpose for that? To what end?
We're exploring what we could do for each other to leverage. They are like an investigative arm of the insurance companies. And so they are very interested in this type of activity because along with street racing, there's lots of stolen cars, parts that are traded back and forth. The parts are very, very expensive. And there's a lucrative underground exchange that goes on with those parts and things like that. Oftentimes they make insurance claims and stuff like that, and they're reckless driving. So they have a huge interest in what people that are covered insurance-wise are doing, because a majority of people who she spoke of fatality collisions. There's tons and tons of minor collisions that never get reported, because as soon as the police arrive, they just start driving, and they drive fast, so they crash into each other and drive out as quickly as they can. So they're constantly running into each other. Oftentimes those get turned into, this is a hit and run in a parking lot or things of that nature. So they have an interest, they have a financial stake in it, and they also have information that's important to us in terms of who owns the cars, who's insured, who's not. So I've heard that in other states there's situations where people can be canceled, their insurance can be canceled on the spot when people find out that there's racing involved. So I'm not sure that we even have that ability, but it's worth exploring. So,
Well, maybe we can take the new parking enforcement vehicle down there that captures all the license plates electronically and capture the data from the people down there and send it to their insurance company.
I mean, there's lots of things to explore. I mean, I think that there's potential for something to be creative. Obviously we have to, balance it with, their privacy interests and things of that nature, but it's definitely worth exploring, so.
Okay. Anything else at this time? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.